You will have, are we ready to record? Sorry, I forgot to ask you that, Joyce. Are we good?
Yes, ma'am. We're getting it started right now, probably about 20 more seconds.
Okay, I'll hold off. Ms. Joseph, if you'll wait just a minute or so. Are we ready, Joyce?
Yes, ma'am. We're ready to go.
Okay, Ms. Joseph, if you have 3 minutes. Ms. Joseph, hear us? Judge Oakley, would you mind muting your microphone, please? Thank you. Ms. Joseph, are you still on the line?
Yes, Madam Chair. I heard you speaking to one of the members.
Okay,
thank you,
go
Madam
ahead.
Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, I'm Zenobia Joseph. My comments are specifically related to item 11, which is a discussion item. It's specifically related to the $633 million of the deferred projects related to Capital Express Central project. I just wanted to call to your attention that while the language in the packet on page 63 specifies project scores and ranking, there were 3 Metro Rapid lines that were in Northeast Austin. Those projects actually scored higher than the ones in Southwest Austin, and there was no discussion on June 8, 2020, when you approved the deferment list. And so I'm asking you to look at that, and hopefully you'll be able to at least discuss why the project scores and ranking was not used for those projects. Specifically, there were 3 lines, MLK, Cameron Road and Dessau to ACC Highland, and Palmer Samsung to Apple. Each of these lines, the Metro Rapid lines, served more minorities than the ones in Southwest Austin. There are 53% minorities MLK, 74% Cameron Dessau, and 55% on Palmer. Compared to Burnett, Manchaca, and Oak Hill, and specifically Convict Hill, there were only 37 to 38% minorities. So my comments are specifically related to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I want you to understand that the scores were 88 and 87 out of 100 for the Northeast lines and 82 and 85 for the ones that were Southwest. It cost more for the ones that were Southwest. They were $41.2 million compared to $18.4 for all 3 of the Metro Rapid lines in Northeast Austin. That's a difference of $22.8 million. And so I'm asking you, and I did testify before Texas Transportation Commission on December 10th, 2020. I asked them to find $4.7 million out of their Category 12 funds to actually fund that rapid line on Palmer Lane. I would just call to your attention the 2014 Project Connect North Corridor Locally Preferred Alternative study actually specified that 58% of the jobs would be in the North Corridor, and they also specified that not only the employment but the connectivity was significant. And so I just want you to recognize that in Southwest Austin, that actually aligns with the state's $633 million Oak Hill Parkway project. But if you're going to operate under accountability, integrity, and transparency, then the scores that are listed in the board packet is what the public sees, and I would ask the board to commit to actually complying with that. Lastly, I'll just tell you that the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2020 prohibits the use of public funds for propaganda, and even after these lines were cut, Capital Metro and the City of Austin continued to tell the public that the Palmer Line route was still there, and also MLK. And that was on the September 25th Joint Sustainability Committee. And I thank you for taking my comments. If you have any questions, I'll gladly answer them at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Joseph.
You're welcome.
Let's see.
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Shea. I'm wondering if Ashby can explain to us about that ranking, or was that a Txdot ranking? It doesn't sound like the highest ranked projects got included, as Ms. Joseph was laying out.
So, Commissioner Shea, the agenda item is about the deferred projects, and we can, if there's a question specifically about that, we can address it when we get to agenda item number 11. But during public comments, you know, we can address that if there is a specific when we get to agenda items, but I'm not sure we ranked specific Cap Metro routes. So I'm going to let staff address that when we get to number 11.
Okay, if we'll just remember that. I would like some explanation or information on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shea. Okay, I want to, let's see, for the record, I saw Mayor Adler come in on the call and saw Councilmember Ellis and Terry Mitchell. I think I saw Mayor Schrader and Commissioner Trevelyan and of course Commissioner Shea. So the only ones I have missing at this point are Allison Alter, Judge Brown, and I think that's it.
Judge Brown is here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't see you show up, but welcome and thank you for.
Cynthia, I think
Councilmember here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. So I think we've got everybody. All right, so let's go ahead and I don't have anything right now on item number 3. We don't have an executive session. So if we want to go ahead and jump to item number 5, which is minutes from the November meeting. Do I have a motion on the minutes?
So moved, Craig Morgan.
Okay, Mayor Morgan, is there a second?
Houston will second.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. All right, is there any, we have a motion by Mayor Morgan, a second by Mayor Houston. Is there any discussion? All right, hearing none. If there is anybody opposed to the motion? Okay, hearing none, motion passes unanimously. Item number 6, discuss and take appropriate action on Campo Executive Director to begin negotiations for legal services contract. I believe Chad is going to update us on this item.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So Campo's current legal services contract expires at the end of this month. And to ensure continuity of legal services, Campo began the process to procure a new legal services contract last year. This process began on October 19th, 2020, when a request for qualifications was posted for Campo Legal Services, with submittals for the RFQ due on November the 6th. We received proposals from the 3 firms that you should see on the screen: Bickerstaff, Heath, Delgado, Acosta, LLP, Kemp Smith, LLP, and Tim Tuggy Law. A Campo staff evaluation team individually reviewed and scored the proposals based on a set of selection criteria, and those scores were then averaged for the final ranking. The selection criteria was included in the RFQ, and it equally weighted previous experience of firms, staffing and attorney qualifications, understanding of scope, and past performance. Based on this evaluation, the results you can see are on the screen now, with the top ranked firm as Tim Tuggy Law with 91 total points, followed by Kemp Smith and Bickerstaff, Heath, Delgado, Acosta. And next slide, please. Based on the results of this review, staff are recommending that the policy board authorize the Campo executive director to negotiate and execute a contract for legal services. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad. Is there a motion on this item?
So moved.
I so move. Okay, sorry.
All right. Motion by Mayor Morgan, second by Kelly. Is there any discussion?
Madam Chair, could we get a little bit of an explanation? I know that Bickerstaff is a very experienced law firm, and I'm interested to know how the firms were ranked based on the criteria, because Tuggy is a small firm, but I'd like to see a little bit more explanation about the ranking and the criteria.
Sure. So
Go ahead.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So for Bickerstaff, the proposal did not include any or indicate any prior MPO experience. The transportation experience that is provided is really unrelated to what was in the RFQ or Campo's processes, and it really focuses more on financing and implementation for local governments, those sorts of projects that they typically work on. As well, the resumes that were included did not indicate any experience that was relevant to Campo or MPO processes.
Was that the category that Tuggy, and I think they're fine. I know Mr. Tuggy and Shannon. I think they do a fine job. But was the greatest weight given that gave them such a much higher score because they had experience providing legal guidance to an MPO?
That was a key. The other really crucial item for the Tuggy law firm is that they were the only one where both of their primary contacts demonstrated MPO experience. None of the others have that.
Madam Chair, I'll just make note that it seems like we may be setting up a criteria that would guarantee that the only firm that would ever score highest is the firm that has been providing legal guidance. And I, while I appreciate the importance of that experience, I also don't want us to have a process that would prevent any other firm from ever really ranking at a level that we would consider them.
So, Madam Chair, may I ask this question? This may help leave you the concerns and speak to what Chad's saying. Chad, it sounds to me that the applicable criterion that was utilized here had denoted specifically the experience and the expertise with MPOs prior to the actual application process. So in your experience, because you guys do this for a living, I just live in a van down by the river, there are other firms that would have just as much experience as such, but they didn't submit themselves to this process. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I'll add that the firm that was second, the Kemp Smith firm, did have MPO experience, and that was that was counted as for why they were in the second place position. The issues there were then again the primary contact listed did not have MPO experience, again not Campo experience but just MPO experience, and most of the firm's work was more on water districts and things like that. So yeah, that middle one there really gives an indication of how the scores work with MPO experience.
No, excellent. No, that's perfectly a fair answer. My suggestion would be just moving forward. What to the commissioner's concern is that the pool of candidates, however we're going about doing the soliciting process and letting people know that it's out there, I would just make sure that we're hitting the full universe of those candidates, so everyone has an ability to do so. I think that Tim has done a phenomenal job by this MPO, to say the least. But at the same time, yeah, we would just want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to be able to go ahead and chip in and try to see what they can do regarding services.
Of course.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Oakley would move approval of the recommendation.
We actually, thank you, Judge, but we already have a motion and a second on the floor.
Oops.
So motion by Mayor Morgan and second by Councilmember Kitchen. Hearing no further discussion, if there's anybody against the motion. Okay, hearing none, motion passes unanimously. Item number 7, discuss and take appropriate action on FTA Section 5310 project criteria.
Thank you very much. This is Ryan Collins with Campo staff, and this item that we're bringing forward to you is an update to the 5310 program criteria. I know we've got a couple of new board members, and so I just want to remind everyone that the 5310 program is it's an FTA program that's administered by a designated recipient in the urbanized area. In this case, that's Capital Metro. But in that selection of a designated recipient, they've delegated the selection of projects to Campo. And the 5310 program itself directly supports transportation programs that are tailored towards seniors and individuals with disabilities. We receive roughly $1 million in funding every year. And so we've been doing an annual call since about 2012. And it's actually over the last few years has gotten incredibly competitive. And so at the last time we did the project selection, I believe this is back in January or February, the policy board did request that we kind of revisit the criteria and the process. It was last approved in 2012. And so we kind of took a holistic review to see if there's anything we needed to kind of change and kind of update and make it a more competitive process. And so that is what this item is today. And I'll briefly just go through the criteria that we currently have and then the recommended changes that we're requesting approval for. And then if we have approval of the criteria, we'll move forward with administering another project call once we get the project criteria updated. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. So just to give you an update on how we did the update, excuse me, the development process. It was pretty extensive. It was an iterative process. We started with the current criteria and we reviewed FTA resources and guidance, frequently asked questions, any resources that FTA had. We also looked at some Transportation Research Board white papers. We also looked at other 5310 program criteria, both across the state and across the country. We've had conversations with the designated recipient Capital Metro. The Regional Transit Coordination Committee gave their feedback on it back in December, I believe it was. And important to note is that the Regional Transit Coordination Committee, this is the 5310 funding is almost their implementation funding. They do a plan every 5 years, and the 5310 funding is really designated to kind of fund those programs that come out of their planning processes. So their feedback was incredibly important. We've taken it to the Technical Advisory Committee twice now. We got their initial feedback, and then once we had a draft of the criteria, we took it back to them and asked for additional feedback. And then, of course, this went to the policy board back in November, where we had a good discussion on that. And then we also I had a good discussion at the Transportation Policy Board Executive Committee. So it's been through several rounds of development. And if you'll go to the next slide, I'll talk about the current criteria. So the current process that we have right now, we have the eligibility on the left. That's just your basic eligibility, location, the sponsor type, and the activity that we would be funding. And then the scoring criteria, which is really the meat of it, is on the right. We had 7 criteria with their respective weights on the right. And if you've had a chance to look at it, I won't really go into a deep dive on these, but I will go, if we'll go to the next slide, I'll show you what the process looks like now and what we're recommending. So for the process update, the eligibility does remain the same. That's nothing we really changed. 2 major changes that have come out of it is that we are going to add a project readiness screening. Previously, the budget was part of the scoring criteria, but we've kind of moved that into the project readiness screening, where you'll have to have a fleshed out budget. We also want to make sure that the sponsors are in good standing with FTA and Capital Metro. And so things like that, and just check that the project itself has been fully fleshed out and is ready for federal funding. And the other major change, as I mentioned earlier, we do this on an annual basis. But one of the overwhelming recommendations was that we should move to a 2-year schedule, as opposed to doing 1 year's worth of funding every single year. We'll do 2 years worth of funding every 2 years. And so that'll be beneficial, I think, especially to these sponsors that apply. Most of these are, small nonprofits and very tailored programs that will be better able to use their resources and time because it is a timely process applying for funding. And it'll also allow them to kind of plan over 2 years as opposed to having to scramble every year to get renewed funding. So that was something we think will be very beneficial to them. And then on the right, we also have the updated scoring criteria. Most of it has remained the same, with the exception of the weights have changed pretty substantially. So we've moved to benefit has remained the same. Program sustainability was part of the previous criteria. We did add program experience. Coordination and partnerships and interconnectivity are both part of the previous criteria that we pulled over. And important to note on those that are at 5 points, we thought were important to evaluate the projects through, with, they're beneficial things, but we didn't want them to, we reduced the weights on these because though they are important, we didn't want them to preclude other new projects from being competitive in the process. We bumped up the scoring for the RTCC plan goals and objectives because this is, like I mentioned earlier, the implementation funding for the RTCC mission and planning objectives. One of the newest ones is the performance measure and monitoring. This is 20 points. This is to ensure that these sponsors do have a performance monitoring system in place, that they're gathering data on how the funding is being spent and on the ridership. And this is really just to line it up with the way the federal funding, the FAST Act really kind of delegated, a very performance-based planning mechanism. And so that's what this is really just to ensure that we can report on the success of this program to the federal government. And so that's why that is in there. And then we also have a cost-benefit analysis, which was previously just a cost-benefit. It was renamed in the previous criteria, but from the draft criteria that you saw back in November, the biggest difference is the cost-benefit analysis was weighted 30 points. And after discussions, I believe Commissioner Beckett brought it up during the executive committee. And we also heard this at the RTCC, that the cost-benefit analysis, while important, was overly weighted. And so we reduced the 30 points down to 20 and then redistributed those 10 points into the benefit, because both the benefit section and the cost-benefit analysis essentially weigh the same things, but one is quantitative and one is qualitative. So we felt like that was a good balance between those two criteria. And so this final draft here actually represents everyone's feedback. And so with that, I'll request approval of the updated criteria and answer any questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate your work on that. I know you work with Commissioner Beckett and others on that. Do I have a motion on item number 7?
Oakley moves approval.
Second.
Okay, Judge Oakley made the motion, and I believe that was Councilmember Mateo with the second. And is there any discussion?
I just have a question, Commissioner.
Go ahead.
Chair. My question just so the public can understand and just to remind us on the timing. So we're with this, we'll be moving to every 2 years. How does that, can you just speak to and explain to folks when that kicks in and how it might impact existing grantees? Because I know that they may be, I just want to allay any concerns that someone may be relying on a certain time frame. Does my question make sense, what I'm asking you?
Yes, I believe I understand what you're saying. So right now, normally we would be doing, our annual call at this time. And so with approval of this, we'll just immediately go into a call after we can get everything updated. And then that would be giving out 2 years worth of funding. So we'd give out this year's funding as well as next to be distributed. So hopefully from a timing perspective, I don't think there are any gaps between the last call and doing this one. So if somebody's relying on this funding, we could probably get it to them pretty quickly. It's really just a matter of updating the materials and educating the sponsors on the new requirements and getting that going. So, but there should not be more than a few month gap, I would think, between the normal time frame. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, that was exactly my question. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
If I could ask a question.
Please do.
I am just curious about the performance measurement and management tool. Is that an internal tool that we are measuring or comparing that we have put forth for the project managers to lay out, or is that something that is external that they set out the performance measurement and management processes themselves?
That's kind of a mix. So we do have some recommended performance measures. There's certain things that we are going to require them to track, such as ridership and things like that. But a lot of these are small nonprofits that probably do not have a performance measure system in place. And so that will certainly be part of the education process as we move forward with this new updated criteria, is really kind of getting them up to speed. I'm sure we'll be providing a lot of guidance on that and possibly giving them a system. And that's what I know the Transportation Research Board and both FTA, I think, have just some standard performance measure systems that we can use. And so I think really just getting those tools to the sponsors is going to be, that'll be something that we're going to partner with them on, so there will be that education component on that. But, you know, that's going to be a work in progress, especially because it is something new for them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, seeing none, I have a motion from Judge Oakley and a second from Councilmember Matea. Is there anybody against the motion on item number 7? Okay, hearing none, motion passes unanimously. Item number 8, discuss and take appropriate action on 2021 transportation set aside program call. Ryan, that's you again.
Thank you very much. If you'll go to the next slide, Emily. So this item is, it's really kind of two things in one, both related to the transportation alternative set aside. One, we're going to be asking for permission to move forward with a project call. And then second, we want to allocate some of this funding to the deferred list. But to remind everyone that the TASA funding is really just kind of a carve out of the traditional STBG funding. It's available kind of for smaller scale transportation projects within the urbanized area, such as just bike and recreational facilities and shared use paths and things of that nature. We get approximately 2.5 million in TASA funding every year. And the last time we did a project call, we awarded funding for fiscal years 2018 through 2022. And so we're anticipating to do a project call from fiscal years 2023 to 2026. And again, like last time, we'll have approximately $10 million with which to allocate, minus whatever we refund to the deferred project list. And then to remind everyone, we'll be using the current project selection process that was approved back in late 2017. That'll include a readiness evaluation, performance measures, and a cost benefit analysis. And I do want to point out that even though this is for fiscal years 2023 and 2026, the reason we're bringing it to you today and asking to move forward with a project call is TASA funding does, unlike STBG funding, have a time limit. Once it hits the proverbial Campo bank account, we have 4 years with which to allocate that, obligate it to a specific project. And because of the time frame it takes to do a project call, and even after the awarding, the project sponsors have to go through the AFA process as well as the environmental process before things are obligated. So in effect, if you're not ahead when it comes to TASA funding, you're behind. And so we're looking to do this project call, kind of get it ramped up through the summer and then towards the end of the year, and hopefully sometime early next year actually do the actual selection. So that is why we're asking for permission to go move forward with that as well. So if you go to the next slide, Emily. In relation to that, we did review the deferred list when we were looking at this TASA funding to identify some TASA eligible projects to prioritize for refunding. So we wanted to get these projects refunded before we moved forward with a project call, so we knew we had the money. And so we identified these projects, and then we held joint coordination meetings with the project sponsors, as well as Txdot, really to kind of gauge the interest in refederalizing these projects, and also to get it kind of review the current status of the project and its readiness and when they could potentially use that funding, and then also determine what administrative steps would be needed, such as whether or not we need a new AFA or if we can refresh the one that they had, things like that. So through those coordination meetings, we are recommending that the policy board refund the Travis County's Blake Banner shared use path. That's pictured there. We'll be allocating roughly $2.2 million in TASA funding to this project. In addition to that project, we are in coordination with the City of Austin on an additional project. There's still a few more things we're coordinating with them on, some unknowns that they're working through. So we may bring forward some additional projects for refunding prior to the TASA call. So hopefully that'll happen sometime this spring, but just want everyone to be aware, in addition to this specific refunding today, that we may have more later on down the road. And I believe that's the conclusion of this item. We'll take any questions and then request approval to move forward with the TASA call and the refunding of the Blake Manor shared use path. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Is there a motion on item number 8?
So moved.
All right.
Second.
Commissioner Trevilian, I'm sorry, who was the second?
Jones.
Thank you, Commissioner Jones. Is there any discussion on this item?
Commissioner, I just had one question for the staff. If we're in the future, when we're looking at refunding some of these projects, is projects that are already still moving forward that weren't delayed, is that part of the criteria, or could that be part of the criteria?
If I understand your question correctly, I think readiness is a factor in prioritizing these projects. If that's because I know, if the sponsor's moving forward with still developing it and moving it through the environmental process, and I'll talk about this in the information item a little bit later, the prioritization process, but it takes into account, how far along that project has been moved forward. Even though it's been deferred, there's an expectation that the sponsors are still doing what they can to develop the projects. And so that was taken into account, and that's why we held those coordination meetings to make sure it was appropriate to refund it. In this case, there were only 2 or 3 projects that were eligible for TASA funding, so there was enough funding to cover all of the projects. But when it comes to a limited amount of funds, readiness and moving forward with that development process will be taken into consideration. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. Well, the main thing I want to make sure that entities aren't penalized for going to construction on some of these projects that were deferred.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Ryan and Commissioner Jones. Are there any other questions on item number 8?
I have a question. This is Councilmember Kitchen.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you for y'all's work with the City of Austin on the Walnut Creek Trail. I understand that there's still discussions there, and that all that relates to when it's ready to come back, and that and thank you for making the point that y'all will continue to work with them, and if it does become ready, then that might be something that can be considered in the spring. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And thank you for your work with the City of Austin staff.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Okay, hearing none. Anyone opposed to agenda item number 8? Okay, hearing none, motion passes unanimously. Item number 9, discuss and take appropriate action on amendments to the policy board bylaws. This was first brought up in October in the executive committee, and then we had a discussion about it in November at our policy board meeting. There was a request that we not bring it up in a December meeting, so it was moved to January. On Thursday, there was some fairly substantial changes sent in by Councilmember Kitchen that Campo's policy board members received on Friday. And so what I'd like to do, given the very short period of time that the policy board has had to look at these changes that have been recommended, what I'm going to do is pull this item from the agenda, and I'm going to set up a subcommittee of Councilmember Matea, Councilmember Kitchen, Commissioner Jones, and Judge Oakley to take just the items related to the officer election and the executive committee. So the scope would be those two items, which I think are the two outstanding items that were largely raised, and that at the next meeting, we'll get the what I believe are cleanup items and non-controversial items taken care of, and then ask this subcommittee to meet, clarify those two areas of scope, and look at what's been proposed, and I can lay out sort of what the goal was in those two things for that subcommittee. Give you all a couple of months to look at that and come back with a recommendation. So I'm setting up that subcommittee, but I am pulling this item for any action today. So we will move on to item number 10.
Chair, may I speak, please?
Oh, I've pulled the item from the agenda, and so what I'd like for you to do is just bring that to the so that we can move on with that.
Chair, I think I have the right to speak to the fact that you have pulled the item.
Well, if I pull the item, there's not an agenda item to discuss.
Chair, I think I have the right to speak to.
I'm going to ask Tim to weigh in, if you could, for us. And I'm not trying to argue with you about it, Ann. I just want to make sure we're following the right protocol. If the item's been pulled, I don't know that we have discussion on it. Tim, could you weigh in on it?
I also would like to ask Tim to weigh in on the fact that you're announcing you're pulling it at the meeting instead of ahead of the meeting, and I don't know if you can do that. And so I'd like our legal counsel. This is news to me. I didn't know that you were going to pull it, even though I tried to reach you before the meeting. And so I would just like to understand if it's appropriate for you to do that. I can certainly understand that you might want to postpone it and vote on a postpone, but to pull an item off the agenda on the day of the agenda without allowing at least some conversation about it, that's what I'm concerned about.
And Chair, I have a legal question as well. And is this ability to pull an item off the agenda and therefore prevent any discussion a unilateral authority that only the chair has, or can any member of Campo do that?
So Tim, I think you've heard two questions.
Our bylaws provide that very expressly that the chair sets the agenda and the business of the board, subject to the executive committee taking up a request to place something on the agenda in a future meeting, which of course could occur, and then the item could be placed on the next fully on the next agenda. But under the circumstances, there's nothing in the bylaws that speak of when the chair has to do that. And I'm certainly not in the position to make up policy in that regard. I will say that I don't think there's any prohibition on comments from other board members about the chair's action if all they are is comments. But I don't see anything in the bylaws that prevents the chair from pulling an item, subject again to the specific provisions of the bylaws that permit the executive committee to mandate that the item be placed on the agenda at a future meeting.
May I ask a follow-up question of our legal counsel?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Tuggy. The question in front of us is not placing an item on the agenda. It's already on the agenda and it's been posted, right. And it's public that it's on the agenda. So, and we are governed by our bylaws. Our bylaws are silent on that particular issue. The other question is Robert's Rules of Order. So Is it your legal opinion that after an item is publicly posted and placed on an agenda, that the chair on the day of the meeting, at the meeting itself, can unilaterally pull an item off of the agenda? Is that your legal opinion?
Yes, because the bylaws say that the chair doesn't speak of agenda per se. Robert's rules provide a 2/3 rule for placing, enforcing, and all those sorts of issues with respect to an agenda. Our bylaws simply say the chair shall set the business, and the word is business, of the board. If the chair wants to pull it, then the chair can pull it. Subject again, however, to the safeguard that the executive committee can force the item up. So if the executive committee wants to have the item as a matter of mandatory practice to be on the agenda, it can meet and vote or cause the item to be placed on next month's agenda.
Okay, so a follow-up question, and then I imagine others might have questions for you, Mr. Tuggy. So the follow-up question is it only the chair that can unilaterally on the day of, after it's publicly posted, pull an item off the agenda? Or can any member? I think that was Commissioner Shea's question.
Our bylaws currently say just the chair.
I am asking you about laws beyond the bylaws. This is related to posting and public notice, because basically the chair is proposing to take an action that there was no public notice about, and it's not a postponement and it's not a vote. She is unilaterally off.
But our bylaws are publicly on our website. Public has complete notice of our bylaws. It's very clear that under any circumstances, the chair has that authority. I'm not saying that, and that's part of the reason we were doing this bylaw review. In fact, under the two competing proposals we have right now, that question is up for discussion. One proposal says that going forward, the entire board could force an agenda item, in which case the chair could not pull the item. In another case, in the other proposal, 2 members of the board could force an item on the agenda, and in that case, the chair, if that were to be adopted, the chair could not pull an item. But the way the bylaws are written right now, the bylaws are are in the public domain. The chair has the authority to do what she proposes to do.
Mr. Tuggy, I will make one more statement, and then Chair, after others ask their question, I would like to make a comment. So, Mr. Tuggy, the bylaws themselves say nothing about the ability to pull an item off the agenda. The bylaws are silent. I would like you to read to me if there is language in there that says the chair can pull it off after it's placed. I agree with you that the chair has the authority to place something on the agenda, but there is no language that I have seen, and perhaps I have missed it, but there is no language in the current bylaws that states specifically that the chair may pull an item off the agenda at the meeting after it's been publicly posted. So if there's language like that, I invite you to read that language to me. I imagine that others may have questions, so I'll allow others to ask questions now.
Council member, there is no such language. The language is simply, and if you'll give me a moment, the chairperson designates in the written notice of the meetings the location and business to be transacted or considered. It doesn't speak to the question that you offer about and what you would have inserted by your interpretation, I gather, that and adding comma, and the chairperson shall not change the business to be transacted or considered after notice of the meeting and business. I don't.
I'm sorry, that language is not in there now, right?
Correct. But
and it's not in our proposal either, I don't believe.
Correct.
Okay.
And I'm telling you in response to your question, I don't read that in there independent.
Okay.
As your legal counsel.
That was my question. So I have some other comments, but I imagine that others may have questions, and so I'd like to allow that to happen first.
Just to be clear, my reason for pulling this is I'm the one that originally brought this item up, both with the executive committee in October as well as in November. And given the changes that were proposed by you at the 11th hour, I wanted the policy board to have opportunity to look at it and to take the time to look at it. There's not a particular rush on this item, and I felt like by setting up this subcommittee, further look at it would give the full policy board a chance to look at what you submitted, as well as that subcommittee to look at it further. And again, this is some cleanup things, and then there's some items that I don't know if it's just you, Councilmember Kitchen, or others have proposed a change on, but this will come back. It's just an attempt to, instead of, because we've spent many hours on this already, and hopefully it'll give the opportunity for that subcommittee to look at it a little further and understand what you were trying to represent with your changes. Nothing nefarious or here, just trying to of the board moving.
Okay, so Chair, I understand your reasons, and I certainly want everyone to have the opportunity to understand and have a conversation, and I think that I'd appreciate the chance to talk with others, and I think that would be very helpful. I do want to just speak to two ways in which this is characterized. The first thing is that the changes, we have, as you did mention, we have had several conversations about that and appreciate that opportunity. And let me just say, I appreciate you bringing it forward in the first place, because I think the kinds of changes that are being proposed are ones that will be helpful to the Campo body and in the long run. So I do appreciate that. I just want to say that the changes that are proposed here were ones that were discussed in November and earlier. So they're not at the 11th hour. The other thing is I did provide this to our staff on Thursday and requested that they send it out on Thursday to provide more time. So I understand your reasons. I don't object to your reasons. I just don't want people to think that at the very last minute we were proposing things that were totally things that we had not brought up previously, because these are things that we had brought up previously. So I just think that it's still fine, if people want more time to think about it and talk about it, but this is not 11th hour.
Go ahead, Mayor Adler.
I want to say that I support the the delay to give people a chance to be able to consider it, and think that forming the committee to take a look at it to discuss it is great. I would like to know that it's going to come back at the quickly, because it's been here since November, so that we can get it resolved. But I do have an issue with the kind of the precedent that would be set for a chair to be able to just pull something off the agenda. I think the committee needs to take a look at that, because I think that we all represent different governmental entities and should have an equal ability to be able to get things onto the agenda to be considered. So I hope that that's something that's addressed. But second, I don't read the language of our current bylaws to say that the chair can pull something off the agenda. Mr. Tuggy, as I read it, what it says is the chairperson has the ability to designate in the written notice of the meeting the location and business to be transacted or considered. And that happened here. The chair, pursuant to the bylaws in her written notice of the meeting, identified the location and the business to be transacted or considered. And once that's happened, then I think it has to be considered, transacted, or considered. Or the body can vote to postpone it or to refer it to a committee. But there's nothing here that gives the chair any power other than to put in the written notice of the meeting the location and business to be considered. And where I think you can see where that is the intent of this meaning is that if someone wanted to put something on the agenda pursuant to these bylaws, and the chairperson has a choice, they can either put it on the agenda or not put it on the agenda, to put it in their written notice of the location and business to be considered or not. If they don't do that, the chair, then you can go to the executive committee and say you should put it on. But if the chair puts it on the agenda, there's no reason for you to go to the executive committee, because at that point you know it's going to come before the body. And for the chair then to be able to put it in her written notice and then to pull it would have removed from that person the ability to have gone to the executive committee to put it on the agenda. So I think that if you read the bylaws, the only power the chair has is to put things in the written notice of what the location of the meeting and the business to be transacted or considered, but there's no ability to pull something off. That at that point it belongs to the body, and a motion to refer to committee or to postpone would be in order, but I think it would require that. In any event, and on that basis, I would support the action being taken today. But I would be I don't want to acquiesce in an interpretation that sets a precedent that gives one person amongst all of us the ability to just pull something from the agenda.
Well, I concur with you that that's something that should be addressed, given the opinions that are expressed here. That you all make policy for this board, certainly not me. And I think that's something that should be clarified in any committee workup on any further recommendations. I agree with you there.
So just to be clear, had somebody else sponsored or put this item on, I would not have felt the liberty to pull it. But this was sort of my item. I brought it up. And so that was the spirit for which I was this one as well. But I don't hear any other, at least violent objection to the direction that we're going.
I do have a question.
Chair Long, this is Houston. I want to be in line to make a point and ask a question.
Okay, go ahead, Houston.
Gladly vote for the postponement for the reasons given, but regardless of bylaws, which ours are silent, once an item has been posted on a government agenda and that meeting has begun, once that item's on the agenda, it belongs to all of us. And I do not believe that any one person has like pull that off the agenda. That's why we had motions to postpone. And so I think that's what we need to do. I'm hearing general agreement, seems like people speaking, that postponement is okay. But I don't think the chair has the right to pull something off the agenda, regardless of who posted it. And I don't want that precedent to go forward. But I would be happy to make a motion for a postponement so we can do this properly.
I'll second that
Thank
motion.
you.
I don't think we need to be talking about the policies on this right now. I'm not good for that, but I would second the motion to postpone the item.
All right, there's a motion by Mayor Houston and hang on a sec. A motion by Mayor Houston, and I believe the second was by Judge Oakley.
Correct.
Chair?
Yes.
I'm wondering if the person who made the motion in the second would accept a friendly amendment to include the rest of what you were talking about, which was to create the committee and provide the time to have the discussion about it and then bring it back after that process was complete.
I'm not willing to put caveats around.
There's no such thing as a friendly amendment.
No.
There's no such thing as a friendly amendment. Doesn't exist. My motion to postpone with the items that you just mentioned, because I was making the motion to postpone based on those items.
Okay,
So
thank you.
If the seconder of my motion will second my restated motion, I would appreciate it.
So the motion by Mayor and seconded by Judge Oakley is to postpone this item and to, now as chair, I do have the authority to set up subcommittees, but that's fine. We'll go ahead and include it in this motion. The subcommittee will be Councilmember Paya, Kitchen, and Commissioner Jones and Judge Oakley to look at the specific items related to the executive committee and the officers and the third item that came up on the agenda. So that's the motion and the second. Is there any further discussion?
Chair Long, this is Commissioner Shea. I have a question for you and for Tuggy. I'll start with Tuggy. Are we operating under Robert's Rules of Order? I'll just tell you, we've looked through the bylaws and could not find that. And so if it's not stated in the bylaws, I would like for the subcommittee to consider adding that. I think we should stipulate that we are operating under Robert's Rules of Order.
It's actually proposed in one of the proposals that has been brought up today. We have been operating under Robert's rules, subject to amendments to those rules by virtue of our bylaws. One of the proposals, that being from Council Member Kitchen.
That's right. We did add that. Good. So that'll be included in the discussion, I think, under the committee, although I thought Cynthia Long said the subcommittee would only consider the duration of the terms and the makeup of the executive committee. Is that correct?
She proposes some cleanup items that would fall in the cleanup as well.
So that would be included in the task of the subcommittee?
Correct.
Okay. And then my question, Chair, is I actually frequently want us to have more thoughtful discussion about some items before Campo. So I would ask that this be a regular practice and not a one-off or aberration. I think that there are many times when we need to have more thoughtful discussion than our meetings appear to allow for. And so I would ask that we be able to send things to a subcommittee like this when it's warranted.
Thank you for those comments.
You're welcome.
Commissioner, there are some other things that I had ideas on. So if the committee is limited to what you had, understand that there'll be a few more things. I would love to have been on this committee because I have gone through, I've got some other ideas. So I hope that we're going to be able to entertain other ideas at our next meeting.
All right, thank you. Is there anybody opposed to this motion?
Chair Long, I have another question.
Okay.
I'm assuming that, and it follows up on what I think it was Mayor Houston just mentioned, that the authority of the subcommittee is to allow addressing other items. I think if I'm remembering exactly how she mentioned it. So I'm wanting to make sure that we have clarity on the authority of the subcommittee.
Well, my original idea for the subcommittee was to look at the things that felt like in both of our November discussion were, the item didn't seem to.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. I'm sorry. What did you say?
My goal was for the subcommittee to look at the things that felt like agreement on, which was the selection of that sort of thing, because the other.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, Chair, the scope of the subcommittee is to look at the items where there may have been some differences between what was originally proposed and some alternatives, but also as Mayor Houston suggested, any other kinds of items. And I would like to suggest that perhaps Mayor Houston might want to participate on the subcommittee. I couldn't tell it. That seemed to be a request from her. So
I would have volunteered if given the opportunity.
I've recommended the subcommittee, and I'd like to move forward with the motion on the floor that includes setting up the subcommittee as I've defined it, and the scope, which would include the officers, the executive committee setup. Hang on.
I think you're muted, Cynthia.
Speakers just
No,
died.
it just cut out.
Sorry, can y'all hear me?
I think heard that.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry,
Yeah,
my headphones are going in and out.
Yes. Yeah, sometimes for us, if somebody turns off their video, the audio will come through better. I don't know if that's the case for you, but it's maybe something we could try.
I'll get through it quickly. I'd like to vote on the motion on the floor, which is set up the subcommittee with the 4 members that I listed, and the scope to include what I've stated, plus any differences between the original proposal and what the City of Austin proposed on Thursday.
So this is Commissioner Shea. So if we would like to honor Mayor Houston's request to be added to the subcommittee, are you saying you are not allowing that?
I am asking the subcommittee to be set the way it is. I'm trying to balance it out with city and county, and I don't want to make it so big that we add another county and another city. So I've tried to have 2 city people and 2 county people. Was the goal in doing that.
I appreciate that goal.
Also, Chair, I wanted to ask a clarification before we vote on this, because I think this is a fairly serious issue. An attorney has raised this issue, because I'm not an attorney, asking that if the bylaws are silent as to an issue, then is it the standard view of the attorney that the chair has the authority to unilaterally decide on any issue?
No.
But that's your ruling in this instance, isn't it?
Well, in this specific question, yes, but not as a general matter. Of course not. No.
Well, then what would be the criteria for coming up with a different interpretation?
Just a reference to the specific language of the bylaws. That's all.
But the bylaws are silent on this issue.
Oh, Commissioner.
Exactly, and I'm not adding language to the bylaws.
Call the question.
Yeah. So the question.
For the record, I disagree with this legal interpretation, and I think it would be
called.
Questions been called. So is there anyone against the motion to postpone?
Chair Long, when the motion is called, we've been through this before, that requires a 2/3 vote of the body in order to stop the debate.
How about this? How about we withdraw the call and note Commissioner Shea's objection and just go ahead and vote? Is there any objection to that?
Cynthia, I'm okay with going to a vote. Just real fast, though. I want to make sure that I don't know what Mayor Houston would be proposing, but I want to make sure that we're not at the next meeting. Mayor Houston proposes something and then people say, well, we didn't know what she was going to do until we got to the meeting. So I'm trying to figure out how it is that she might be able to make sure that people kind of get noticed or get considered. And one thing she could do is she could give it to one of the 4, or she could give it to the people that are on the committee, and then the committee can make that part of what they consider, unless by saying that it's limited to just the differences between what Councilmember Kitchen submitted, they wouldn't be able to consider what Mayor Houston submitted. I'm just trying to figure out how to get hers or anybody else's ideas into the hopper so that people don't complain at the next meeting that, or people are not in fact surprised at the next meeting with something.
I don't mind sending it to the committee.
Thank you.
Can they consider it then, Cynthia, if it comes from Mayor Houston as opposed to being a difference between Ann's version and your version?
So I guess here's my question. I'm trying to get us to an endpoint. We've discussed this in October in the executive committee. We've discussed it in November there, so Mayor Houston, please look at both versions. What you have may be covered. And if not, get it to the committee to look at, and they can figure out whether it's covered there or not and include it. But
I've spent probably an hour and a half on these already, so I know what's in there.
Great. Well, thank you. All right. Is there anyone against the motion to
You have Council Member Alter wants to speak, Madam Chair.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair Long. I think making a motion to postpone is an appropriate step as a next step. I just wanted to clarify, I had a question that I wasn't able to address with our legal counsel having to do with the size of the executive board that I would still like to get some clarity on. And it may be that that group needs, depending on what they recommend, because as of now, you can have 10 members of the executive board by the time you're done because of the Txdot being ex officio. And I'm not understanding how the quorum rules, et cetera, play out with that, and wasn't able to address that. So I would like an opportunity to speak with the council. And then if there are issues that need to be addressed, refer to the committee to think about that, which is on the issues of the size of the executive board, which is one of the items. I just want to make sure that that's not precluded. I was not able to get that done, and I appreciate the extra time that the postponement that you're proposing, Chair Long, would allow.
Council member, the executive committee is one of the items for them to discuss, but clearly it either will be less than a majority of the board, or if for some reason it's not, the meeting would be posted. So anyway, that's just, but there's never been a time where the executive committee has been more than a quorum of the board, nor would I foresee it that. But.
Right. My questions, though, are about how quorum functions then. If the executive board is just up to what a quorum is, then they cannot serve the function of informing other people if they can't go talk to other people. And I'm not understanding how that's working.
Okay, well, that's one of the items for that executive committee, that subcommittee to look at.
Right, thank you.
I have one other question for clarification, Chair.
Sure.
And it's a question of Mayor Houston. Mayor Houston, that your motion to postpone, what date are we postponing to?
I believe, and I don't want to put words in now, I believe Chair Long's expectation is that this is going to come back on the next agenda.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted clarification.
No, that was not what I had suggested. Was that there were some what I thought was non-controversial cleanup items that would come back at the next agenda. But I think giving this group a couple of months to work through it would be appropriate given everybody's calendars. So I'd like for the committee to meet and come back and just let me know how many, at what point in time you think you can bring it back.
Okay, I'm fine with that. Let's take the time that we need to do it and get it done properly.
Okay. Is there anybody opposed to the motion?
I have one last question, Chair Long. I'm sorry. I appreciate that and support the time for the committee to consider and bring this back. But I think for me, I'm not understanding, and I want to be sure that this will be placed on the agenda this spring. So I wouldn't want the committee to bring something back and then not have clarity for the board on when it was going to come back. So I'm just asking, so I think I heard you commit to putting it on an agenda in the spring after assuming that the committee works through the process by that time. So I just want to put that.
You're a member of the committee. Y'all come back to us. Why don't you give us a report at the next meeting and tell us when y'all think you can be ready to put it back on the agenda?
Okay, that's fine. That provides some clarity. Thank you very much.
And Chairman Long, this is Commissioner Shea, I've got another question. I have understood from a Chamber of Commerce, recent meetings at Chamber of Commerce in Aero, that you are requesting that they nominate members for a business advisory committee or something for Campo. Is this something that needs to be added to the bylaws, or I don't understand where that comes from and how that fits in?
We're really off topic here.
Not part of this agenda.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'd like for it to be raised, so I guess I'll wait till the end of the written agenda, and if there's any opportunity for new business or other questions, I think this body should at least discuss it. Unless everybody's fine with the chair doing things like that without bringing it to the policy board.
This is Corbin. I guess my question when it comes to appointing rules committees or business committees or any kind of committee, is it the legal affair? Is it the legal?
Sorry, I had a pause in the video there.
Yeah, when it comes to
can y'all hear me?
Committees.
Okay. So is there anybody against item number 9?
Madam Chair, you had Corbin speaking.
Can't hear.
Hello?
Can you speak up, Corbin?
Okay,
it's a little hard to hear you.
My question was, when it comes to appointing committees, like rules committees or bylaws.
Okay, I'm sorry. I lost my audio there. Is there anybody against item number 9?
Mayor Van Arsdal is in the middle of a question.
I'm sorry. I lost my audio. Couldn't hear.
Okay. So my question was, because someone brought up appointing like a business committee, we've talked about appointing a rule or a bylaws subcommittee. Is it the legal counsel's view that that those committees are what's under section 6A of the bylaws? Is that where that's falling under right now?
I'm not sure about the specific reference, number reference, but yes, there's a provision within the bylaws for committees to be formed, and that is applicable here.
And it requires the consent of the exec committee to do that?
The executive committee can approve it after the meeting. And of course, the policy board by a motion can do what it wants, notwithstanding the bylaw requiring the executive committee approval.
Gotcha. Well, that was my concern because we're talking about bylaws, which is sort of fundamental to the organization, and I don't think I guess I'm disappointed that this is where we're at, because it sounds very adversarial. It sounds very like different folks are suspicious of each other. It sounds like there has not been a work group working on bylaws, which is every time I've done bylaws, whether it's for a church or a nonprofit, you do it collaboratively, and where you can't agree, you bring those points forward. And I hate that we, last time we were trying to do it with lame duck members. Now we're doing it with we have some brand new board members, their first meeting, and this is what we're doing. I would like to see us, be more collaborative about this and let people talk about it. Board members should be allowed to bring forward changes with plenty of notice. I like having more notice to know. I was myself trying to do side-by-sides of all these various red lines, and it was a hell of a lot of work. I would just like to see us be more collaborative and err on the side of talking and communicating as opposed to the other way around. So therefore, I'm absolutely support the motion to postpone.
And I want to support what the mayor's saying right here. It's like even when we all agree, we still have to argue. and there's a way that we can make our points. Hey, we have different viewpoints and ideas of how we get to it, but let's make sure that no one's here. Don't cast aspersions when it's unnecessary. You know, we don't think anyone's having any malice intent or anything else over here. There's this stuff got sent in. They want to have more time to look at it. I got pulled. We all agree on that. Let's just move forward with it. And I agree that whatever needs to be done gets submitted to the subcommittee. Additionally, until this discussion, I didn't realize we have too many attorneys on there. Good Lord, you get all sorts of different interpretations. All the folks over here with that stuff as well. But hopefully, we can all get to some consensus and have a vote and have something given on that. So, thank you, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Sorry, my audio was going out earlier, so I apologize if I am repeating myself once again. But do we have anybody opposed to item number 9? Okay, so that passes unanimously. Item number 10 is discuss and take appropriate action on Txdot's UTP program. And we've got Heather that will update us on that.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, let me get my presentation up here. Okay, good afternoon, Chair, board members. Today I will be presenting on Txdot's Unified Transportation Program, or UTP, which is our 10-year plan that guides the development of transportation projects across the state. Funding levels in the UTP are based on forecasts of potential revenue that may be available over the next 10 years. Because funding levels change in the future, the UTP does not serve as a budget or guarantee that certain projects will be built. Instead, the plan authorizes Txdot and local partnering agencies to prepare projects for construction based on a potential future cash flow. Next slide. The UTP is the 10-year plan that guides development of transportation projects across the state. A determination is made on how much funding the state expects to have over the next decade and how to distribute it. The plan includes all transportation projects that Txdot is developing for construction over the next 10 years, organized into 12 funding categories. The UTP is required by state law and approved by the Texas Transportation Commission each year by August 31st. The UTP may be updated out of cycle for major changes. Next slide. The set of documents shown here make up the planning and programming process from long-term vision to project development. The recently adopted 2050, next slide actually. Backwards, okay. The recently adopted 2050 statewide long-range transportation plan is adopted every 4 years and defines the goals, performance measures, and targets for the next 24 years, which provide the basis for the UTP's funding distribution and project listings. Also in the long-term vision is the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, your currently adopted 2045 MTP. In the middle of Txdot's series of transportation plans is the UTP, which links the goals, performance measures, and targets of the long-range plans with specific transportation projects as they move through the development process. The Statewide Transportation Program, STIP, is Txdot's statewide program of projects that it expects to be ready for construction in the next 4 years. The STIP incorporates metropolitan and rural transportation improvement programs, TIPs, into a single statewide document. Txdot has diligently been working to achieve fiscal constraint with the current 4-year STIP. Finally, once a project is listed and an approved STIP, Txdot's 2 years letting schedule authorizes and administers it for construction. Next slide. Step 1 in the UTP development is establishing statewide goals, performance measures, and targets. The Commission has set 3 statewide strategic goals for the transportation system through the SLRTP and those are to promote highway safety, preserve existing infrastructure assets, and optimize system performance for drivers in urban and rural areas. Step 2 is to develop the planning cash forecast where Txdot's Financial Management Division estimates the revenue expected to be available to Txdot for transportation project construction over the next 10 years. Step 3 is to determine the UTP funding distribution by category, by which the Commission uses the strategic goals, performance measures, and targets laid out in Step 1 to determine the dollar amounts needed in each of the 12 UTP categories to best achieve those targets. Step 4 is to select and implement projects by working with planning partners such as Campo to make the investments. Finally, data is collected on transportation system performance, which is used to inform future performance measures and targets. Next slide. Projects are identified years in advance of their actual funding and construction, and the UTP is focused on identifying and managing the volume of projects that are to be advanced from planning through detailed project development to construction. Projects are given authority to advance through the UTP. Plan authority is the holding area for proposed future projects outside the fiscally constrained 10-year UTP and includes feasibility studies. Projects and develop authority are authorized to begin preliminary engineering and environmental. To advance into develop authority, a project must rank highly among other potential projects at the regional level, and the project's estimated construction cost must fit within the 10-year planning constraints. Finally, projects in construct authority can proceed to the final stages of development in preparation for construction and must be fully funded. Next slide. The previous image has been flipped here vertically into a hopper with valves. The top part in gray is plan authority, where projects 11 years plus are waiting to enter the UTP. The top valve is throttled based on the 10-year planning scenario forecast, and every year, once projects are let for construction, they move out of the UTP, which allows for more projects to be programmed into the UTP. The UTP simply lines dollars up with anticipated construction cost. Once projects are in the UTP hopper, they begin to progress through the planning process. Once projects achieve STIP approval and construct authority, they hit the 2-year letting schedule, and we have to account for the dollars. Operational cash forecast comes into play in the last 2 years when the projects line up with the biennial budget. The valve can be adjusted at this time, and if there are changes in revenue, and projects can slow down or speed up as needed. Next slide. This image shows the 10 key steps and timeline for developing the UTP. The districts work with local partners, TPP, and administration on developing the UTP for commission approval in August of each year. The majority of district involvement is in step 5, which is where we are now, shown with the red star, prioritizing potential transportation projects locally. Next slide. The Austin District has been making informal project submittals to TPP for the 2022 UTP since November, with a draft list due this week that will compete statewide for project selection. Next, the Commission begins reviewing the statewide submittals and preliminary scoring, and results will be discussed with the districts as part of the scoring process that extends through March. Commission review of the projects takes place from April to June, and the draft UTP is released to the public this summer with a public meeting and hearing in July. Finally, the UTP is presented to the Commission in August for adoption. Next slide. This year, in selecting projects, we have prioritized fully funded projects currently showing a funding gap. Funding Campo projects that were deferred last year for I-35 Capital Express, projects with committed local funding, and finally, based on project readiness. Next slide. The district is recommending the following draft list of Campo deferred projects for consideration of Category 2M funds. The Loop 360 grade separation at Courtyard is the biggest ticket item. Also on the list is US 290 intersection improvements at Troutwine and Hayes County, along with improvements to SH 29 and US 281 in Burnett County. The final roadway improvement on the list is RM 2243 in Williamson County between Southwest Bypass and Norwood Drive. Additionally, 3 corridors of 71, RM620 and Palmer Lane, and Travis and Williamson County are being submitted for ITS improvements to bring a series of cameras and message boards and the infrastructure and communication systems that go along with those devices. Additionally, in the 2022 UTP, we are proposing $66 million in Category 12 strategic priority for Campo deferred projects. These projects would be made public this summer if they successfully compete with other statewide projects in the draft UTP. Next slide. Project Tracker is Txdot's online project reporting system and interactive map. Here, you can look at the 8,000 projects in all 12 UTP categories in the various stages of development. The UTP is a subset of the projects in categories 2, 4, and 12. This concludes today's presentation.
Thank you, Heather. That's exciting news to see that we've got some projects moving up. Does on item number 10, is there a motion on item number 10? Can you all hear me? Okay, the chair makes the motion for item number 10. Is there a second?
Oakley seconds.
All right. There's been a motion and a second on item number 10. Is there any questions?
I have a question. It's Councilmember Alter.
Okay, go ahead, Councilmember.
I have
Are
two
you
questions.
doing the happy dance that you got one of your projects reinstated?
I am very, very excited. And that was one of the things I was just going to say. I just wanted to clarify what the motion was, since these are category 2 and we don't have to vote. So I just wanted to understand what the motion
I think it's just,
was. And then I had another question.
Thank you for that reminder. My motion is to acknowledge this list as presented by Txdot.
Great, thank you. That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah, I'm really pleased that we are able to move some projects forward on funding that were deferred. My question is just, there was a comment that the speaker made towards the end about additional projects that were not on this that might be added at a later point, and I didn't quite follow that. So I just wanted to ask her if she could repeat that, because there were many projects that were deferred. So I just wanted to.
That's correct. We have been submitting other projects in other categories. The UTP is categories 2, 4, and 12. So there are some Campo deferred projects that we're working with our internal with division right now and commission. We're presenting those projects, and if they compete statewide and move forward, that would be made public in the summer for the strategic priority Cat 12 projects.
Great. So the other projects, so this set of projects is just for category 2, and then you'll be making recommendations in other categories as you finalize that work. That's correct. Great. Thank you for clarifying the process, and I'm pleased to see we're able to move forward with some additional projects. Thank you.
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Shea. I have some questions of the speaker as well.
Go ahead, Commissioner Shea.
I am pleased to see, as Councilmember Alter just referenced, that some of the projects are being put back in the funding stream. But can you speak to what assumptions or what the basis is for identifying the money? The comptroller just announced that there will be less of a shortfall than he initially anticipated, but will still be $1 billion shortfall in the state budget going into this next legislative session. And many economists have talked about what they believe will be a kind of a long tail on the economic recovery from the pandemic. So I'm curious about what the analysis is for the additional source of funding, and what you're seeing for the next few years going forward, and what we might be potentially looking forward to in terms of other projects being put on, because as you are probably aware, it was a very unhappy process when we had to give up many local projects which had already been approved for funding in order to fund I-35. So I'd really like to know your assumptions about this additional money and then what you're seeing for the next few years, so we might have some sense of how much additional money to expect.
How'd the vote go on that one?
If I could weigh in just a second, and I think Tucker, you may want to weigh in on that. I think that's probably a commission sort of decision, but Tucker, feel free to weigh in on that.
Yeah, in one case, it is a commission decision, but whoever's running this, could you go to the previous slide that showed the list of projects?
And am I correct in understanding it's about $72 million in funding?
I was just going to quickly add that up in my head. We didn't have a total there at the bottom, but this category 2 projection was given to us by our commission and our transportation planning and programming division. And this is, again, taking all the things, Commissioner, that you mentioned into consideration for what the next 10 years of our UTP would be. And one of Heather's first comments that explained what the Unified Transportation Program is a 10-year planning document. It's not a budget. It's not a commitment of money, but it is what we expect to receive for these funds for the next 10 years. So if we have a project that is in the UTP and we're developing it, and it comes to the time 4 or 5 years from now that we let it, and the budget projections fall through and it's not there, we would not be able to let that project. So this is not a cash flow, it's not a budget, it's not a commitment, but it's a 10-year planning document on what we anticipate would be available for the next 10 years. And I know our commission has worked very closely with our programming division to take everything that's happened in the last 12 months into consideration of putting these funding projections together.
So even looking at the comptroller's latest assessment, which is $1 billion shortfall, and understanding that economists are concerned about how quickly the economy can recover, your analysts are still projecting that within this rolling 10-year UTP timeframe, we will be seeing the 72 million potentially, and then future allotments of money that could restore some of those projects that were not maintained, that were deferred.
Yeah, and we are one of the 25 districts going through this exercise. So the UTP on a 10-year plan last year was a little bit over $75 billion for the 10 years. And I think it's coming in slightly lower than that this year at about 72, 73, but that is the projection of our analysts for the next 10 years of about $73 billion statewide.
Well, if they're able to provide a little more insight into some of the assumptions around this, I'd be very interested in seeing it. And you can just email it to me directly if others aren't interested, but it doesn't seem to square with what Comptroller Hagar is projecting and what all kinds of economists are fearing. Sure. So anyway, thank you. Appreciate it.
Let me see what I can grab and send it to you for any clarification.
That'd be fabulous. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's a motion and a second on the floor. Are there to accept the item number 10? Is there any further discussion? All right. Is there anybody opposed to item number 10? All right. That passes unanimously. Item number 11 is discussion on the prioritization process for deferred projects. Mr. Collins.
Thank you very much. If you'll just go to the next slide, Emily. So this item, kind of playing off what we just discussed, both in the TASA item and also in the UTP item, is putting together a prioritization process for projects that were deferred back in June for the I-35 project. And we wanted to get a draft process together for discussion because we, not quite sure when funding is coming in, but we do expect we need to have a process in place, in the near future in case we do receive any funds from the CARES Act or anything like that. So we've put together a process here, and I'll just run through it briefly. Essentially, it's just a 4-step process, but what it really focuses on is project readiness. But what we'll start with is the funding section. We'll look at funding availability as it comes in and check those eligibility requirements. And that'll determine the preliminary list of projects from the deferred list that we'll be able to consider. And then we'll reach out and coordinate with the sponsors to determine interest in funding and check the initial status of the project. And then really the meat of this process is really looking at readiness. So we'll evaluate the projects just to look at the current development status. And we also want to look at project changes that may impact the original scope. We do know that by the time we are refunding projects, there may have been some changes. This is a rapidly developing region, and some sponsors either may have moved forward with their projects or shelved their projects, or other developments that may impact how a project was originally evaluated. So we do want to kind of revisit that original scope and also validate the funding request and the cost estimates to ensure that everything is lined up for being refunded. And then we will do a joint coordination call both with the sponsors and Txdot to do that administrative review of the advanced funding agreement and potential let dates. And so what this process really does is it prioritizes the earliest, the project that is the most ready, the ones that have gone through the environmental process and things like that will be prioritized for funding first. And in the case that we have projects that have similarly scheduled potential let dates or kind of on the same development schedule, at that point, we'll dip into the evaluation scores that, because we have scores for every single one of these deferred projects, we'll use those in the event that we have similar schedules and prioritize the one with the higher ranking score. So that's really just a summary of the prioritization process. If there's anything else, any questions about it, it's a fairly simple process. It's really just getting the information on the readiness and then using the evaluation scores as necessary. So this is almost exactly the process we used when evaluating the TASA eligible projects. So that concludes the presentation, and I'll take any questions.
Ryan, can you go back and address Commissioner Shea's question from the public comments?
You have to remind me of that question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, which one was that?
I think it was a question that came up based upon what Ms. Joseph raised.
That's right.
And it was Commissioner Shea, if I remember correctly, she raised some issues, and it was about specific bus routes, I think.
Yeah, I thought she said a ranking process for transit.
And I don't, and I think there was some confusion there. If that's what your question was, Commissioner.
I was simply asking what the ranking process was that she was referring to, but is she talking about us getting deferred projects reinstated?
So Commissioner Shea, I have had an email exchange with Ms. Joseph while we were in the meeting, and she sent me the table from previous meetings that had the scores in it. And it was when we scored the projects for the long range plan for the 2045 plan. It was not for the transportation improvement program. Okay. So that's because I was a little confused as I was listening to the comments, because Cap Metro didn't submit any of those for inclusion in the tip, so therefore they were not deferred.
Right.
And when I looked at what Ms. Joseph sent me, the let years for, the estimated let years for those projects were outside of the tip window. So that's how I know for sure they're 2045 plan projects that were included so that Capital Metro can proceed with the environmental analysis and meet federal requirements, and not deferred projects out of the tip.
So that her question really isn't germane to this discussion.
Correct.
But maybe it would be helpful to at least provide some information about the scoring in an email. I don't know if you're sending that out to board members, but I'd be interested to see as it relates to what she talked about.
Yes, ma'am. I'll send you I sent a response back to Ms. Joseph. I'll expand on that and send it out.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. But on this prioritization process, I'm sure the board will recall, because it was a very difficult conversation. We used several different scoring criteria. And those different methodologies produce different ranking. And it made various jurisdictions unhappy depending on where their projects ranked. So I am not clear at all, Ryan, from what you described, what exactly the methodology will be for ranking these projects? Because you're talking about the projects that were deferred that had previously been identified for funding, right? You're talking about a prioritization process for considering those projects?
Yes, ma'am. And to clarify, when I talk about the evaluation scores, there were different processes. You know, we had those different scenarios back when we had that deferral process. But I'm specifically talking about the actual evaluation scores that come out of our project selection process. So it looks at the performance measures and the cost benefit analysis. So almost all of the projects that were deferred in 2018 had, and last year were evaluated through that process in 2018 for the project call. And then I don't know if you recall, we had like 8 or 9 projects that we did not have scores for because they had been awarded previously. So we actually went back and scored those through our recent project selection process. So those are the scores I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the scenarios themselves, only the actual evaluation scores. That's like for the roadway projects, it's 50% cost benefit analysis and 50% performance measures. So we actually have, you know, just objective scores on these projects.
But if I'm understanding what you've listed here on this slide, is readiness going to be a top criteria for ranking? So never mind the other stuff. Readiness is going to be, and readiness is based on the timetable for the project? Because we had talked about also looking at projects that were going to be completed sooner rather than later.
Yes, ma'am. And so that's what this process really does focus on, readiness, because all of these projects at one point or another were selected by the policy board and have been, you know, through that action in June were prioritized for refunding. So it was really looking at, you know, it's very beneficial for the region to really focus on spending the funds as they come in as quickly as possible. That way we can, you know, if there's additional funding available, we can, you know, pull that funding in. So that's why it focuses so much on readiness, so that we don't refund a project that's not going to be ready for 4 years while another one's ready next year.
Yeah.
And it's just sitting there. So that's why it focuses on that. And only if we get similar let dates, that's when we pull the evaluation scores in, just to use it as a tiebreaker mechanism, essentially.
And the readiness and the let dates will be based on if all the engineering is done, if all the right-of-way has been acquired, if all the utility location and relocation assessment has been done. What other factors are included in the readiness?
It's really environmental. And you know, the process itself will really kind of focus on those. You know,
there's a bad echo. There's a bad echo. I'm having trouble hearing you. Can people mute if they're not speaking?
Yeah, I can hear the echo too. Thank you. So yeah, that's really, I mean, I think you kind of cut to it, is really looking at the where it is in the development process. And so we're hoping, you know, the projects that are deferred, almost all of them were construction funding. And so we're expecting the local governments to really kind of continue developing them. And that includes finishing up the engineering, purchasing that right away, and going through the environmental process, like you had mentioned. And those are lengthy processes. So that's why we're hoping that sponsors will move forward with that. And then, so this process will really kind of prioritize those who are continuing to work on their projects.
I think I see a question.
What is the timetable for bringing back this next tranche of projects to be considered for prioritization? What's your timetable roughly?
I think we're looking at a year or two. You know, that's we're waiting to see actually what's going to come out of Congress. So that'll be interesting. And also with the CARES Act, I do believe we're expecting to see a little bit more STBG funding that we would normally receive. And I'll let Ashby talk to that. I think he's going to talk about it a little bit later in the meeting. But we are expecting some additional funds to come into the pot within the next couple of years. And so we can hopefully start hammering away at that deferred list pretty shortly. So that's why we wanted to go ahead and get this process in place.
Well, yeah, and if it's CARES funding, that would be available potentially very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So less than a year or two. It's just, I think all the communities need to understand how they're going to be scored. And if part of it is get busy, get your engineering done, acquire your right of way, do your environmental. Sounds like that's something that everybody needs to be getting busy on.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a question from Councilmember Alter. I do want to interject one question also, and I think this came up when we were going through the process last year, and I believe it was Councilmember Kitchen that raised the issue of what happens if during this interim time that somebody, a local government, finds other sources of funds and funds a project that had previously received funds. What happens, and do they get credit for that? And so if you'll answer that question, and then we've also got a question, I think, from Councilmember Alter.
Yes, and that's actually something we're kind of looking for, directive from the policy board. I think, you know, we do have that list, and if I do know for a fact that some projects, some of the local sponsors are moving forward with those projects under their own dime. So whether or not they get prioritized for different projects, I think we're just going to focus on the deferred list. But and Ashby may be remembering this differently, but that's also a policy discussion as well. If the policy board believes governments need to get credit for spending their own funding and moving their projects forward without the federal funding, that's something to certainly consider.
Yeah, what I heard was a slightly different question, and maybe I misheard it. And if so, Councilmember Alter, please provide a little bit more information. So, if the question is, a local government has continued to work on a project and it receives restored funding, let's say next year, if the question is, do you get refunded for the money that your local money that you spent getting the project ready? The answer is no, because that's outside of an AFA, and that was relayed at the time. That has not changed. That's federal law.
Just to clarify, I don't think that was Councilmember Alter's question. I might have inappropriately misstated Councilmember Kitchen's question, but it's one I had as well. It was fully understanding that you can't go back in time with an AFA, but and it's something that, to Ryan's point, that the policy board needs to address. If City of Austin, for example, had a project and that project had been deferred, and they decided with local funds to go spend money on that project. I think there was some discussion, we never landed on anything, but the policy board will need to address that as what happens. Does City of Austin get credit for that $5 million or whatever they might have spent on that? And what does that look like? And I'm just using that hypothetically as a question. It could be Bastrop or whoever, it doesn't really matter. It's, does that entity get credit? But so, you know, we're not going to answer that today. We just need to ponder that. But go ahead, Councilmember Alter.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm fully understanding what we're doing here and what we're talking about. So in the prior item, we were talking about Category 2 funds, which the policy board doesn't sort of distribute. We were acknowledging this is what was going on, that we've been briefed. Now we're looking at Category 7 funds, which are funds that we do have a say in allocating. Many millions of dollars were deferred in order to prioritize I-35. And now we're saying when we get new funding for Category 7, how are we going to prioritize projects? And we have said we are going to prioritize the projects that were deferred. And then this is the process for determining, you're discussing the process that will be used to determine which of those deferred projects would be funded next from that funding. Is that correct understanding before I ask my question?
Yes.
Okay. So then I understand a difference between a project that's ready in 4 years versus one that is ready now, that we would want to prioritize that, regardless of the evaluation scores. But what I don't understand is if we had a project that was ready in 1 year that had a super evaluation score than another, why we would set up a process that would prohibit us from funding that project that had a much higher evaluation score, but that was ready, say, in a year. And it seems like this process really prioritizes the readiness over the evaluation scores. And I'm curious as to why we are not putting evaluation scores above that or doing some combination, which is, I think, where we landed on when we made our choices before, because it was that combination that we were trying to get right. We wanted projects that were going to move quickly, but we also wanted to do with limited funds, we wanted to choose the projects that were going to have the biggest bang on regional mobility. So can you help me understand why we didn't do more of that mix or put evaluation with higher weight?
Yes, ma'am. And I guess really kind of talking to the readiness and evaluation scores, you know, the funds are going to be coming in buckets at different times. And so we didn't think it was, if we, like you said, we may have one that scored, maybe the #1 projects, but it's not ready for a few years. But so by the time it is ready, we'll have another bucket of funding coming in. And so that's why readiness was the primary focus, because all of these are going to get refunded at one point or another. And we didn't think it was appropriate through this process, I guess, when we're fleshing it out, really to refund a project that really isn't going to use the funding for a few years, when we can get the other one, even though it's lower ranking, we can get that one built and on the ground before the other one was even ready. So we thought it was, the most expedient way to use the funding. And it would really, since these are all in some way, shape, or form prioritized and going to get refunded at some point, it's really just trying to get, the most the projects on the ground as fast as possible. So that's really where that thinking is, because I mean, they're all, even though we do have scores on these, they're all a priority for the policy.
So help me understand. I understand, again, as I mentioned, that if there's the difference of multiple years, but if it were like 1 year, why would you not want to consider that?
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. And I mean, I guess it just depends on, when the funding we're expecting in the future to come in. So if we're expecting some funds to come in, I mean, we get funding annually. So a 1 year difference probably, from a readiness perspective is, I guess, pretty significant, since we're going to have a bucket currently, and then we would have another bucket in a year. So when I talk about similar let dates, I would think within a 6-month time period, to me, is what feels like a similar let date. So.
Okay. Okay. And then can you describe again, I know you mentioned this a little bit earlier in response to Commissioner Shea, but just so there's clarity for those who are working on these projects, what is being evaluated as readiness?
Just really engineering. I would say almost all of the ones on the deferred list were funded for construction. So all the things that are leading up to construction, this goes into, it's really engineering, PS&E work, any right-of-way and utility work, and then specifically also the environmental process, the NEPA process, since these are all going to be federalized projects. And sometimes that can take, they all kind of take a while. I think right-of-way purchasing really does take the longest out of all of those, but those are all the things that need to be worked on, just so it can get ready to let.
And you're saying that the anticipation is that we would have some funding coming in pretty much on an annual basis, and so that a project that scored high on an evaluation but wasn't ready in year 1 would have a good chance of getting funded in year 2. And if in year 2 there were 2 projects that were both ready, then you'd pick the one that was a higher valuation score.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Thank you.
And Ryan, to be clear, that applicable information is going to be made available for folks, so each entity and any interested parties are able to get it accordingly, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Thank you, Bo.
Councilmember Kitchen, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, it's just a follow-up to this. So I know that the readiness criteria is written. I mean, I know that we went through that in the past, and y'all have various documents around that. Can you just remind people, if they want to see the detail about where they can look? I mean, you've explained it pretty well for us. I appreciate that. But can you point people to the document where where those various aspects of readiness are explained, if they want to see something in writing?
Absolutely, and we can certainly send this out as well. In our project selection criteria, there is a section about the readiness, but I would actually point you to the local government project procedures from Txdot. They have a manual on there that takes you through the entire development process of a federalized project. So those steps that are in that list in that manual, actually, I use that manual all the time, and I think it's a great resource for all of the local governments who are working on these projects to read through that to see what they need to do to get these projects ready. So I'll get with our admin and get that sent out to everyone, because it is a fantastic resource.
Yeah, or what you may want to just do, I don't know how much detail people want to see. You may make a simple list and then refer people to the, perhaps to the document in itself, So, and you've done a good job of kind of verbally listing that right now. So I appreciate that. So then a related question, I know we're all talking about, and there is an expectation of additional funding coming in. At what point I guess what I'm wanting to see, and I realize that it's not available today, but what I would love to see is some kind of projection of the dollars that we expect and the timeline we expect it, because I think that would help us see what you're talking about in terms of when these deferred projects might come up again. What's the thinking about preparing some kind of projection for us?
We can certainly do that. And going back to the UTP, Txdot does do projections for Category 7 funding. So, right now we receive about $35 million a year, and they've got it projected out for 10 years. And I think it gets up to like 38 towards the end. But I can send that out, and that's certainly something we look at. So I can prepare something for that and get that out as well. So I think that's a good thing to do, though. So absolutely.
Thank you. Now, we also know that there are federal funds, that the expectation is that additional federal funds have been identified in what was recently passed, for example. And so I'd love to see some kind of projection related to that, to the extent that it's not what you just referenced in the EP. So that would help. And then I know you guys are working with our various staffs. So to the degree we get, can think in terms of a heads up of what's coming, that would be helpful. And it would also, I think others have already made this point and already asked this question. It's like, we all want to be able to move ahead, with various projects, but we don't want that to result in, penalizing us from the standpoint of being eligible for projects. So I'm sure you're working with each entity in terms of the extent to which they have projects that are asking about that. So anyway, that's why I'm asking about helping us make sure we see what's coming, and we don't, lose an opportunity, and that we also aren't losing an opportunity because we need to move forward with some things that were deferred.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other questions? Okay, that concludes item number 11. We'll go on to item number 12, and I think that's, let's see, the TDC discussion.
Thank you. So if you'll go, thank you, Emily. So this item is to discuss the transportation development credit policy that we have. We had a policy update back in 2017, and I believe this came up from Commissioner Shea, correct me if I'm wrong, but we wanted to take a kind of a fresh look at our TDC policy. Every time we come up to approve some TDCs for an application, one thing that always comes up is that we have a ton of TDCs in this region, and it's a financial tool. And so the kind of the impetus for doing this, kind of revisiting the policy, is to see, is there anything else we can do to effectively use the TDCs? And so we took a step back again, and I think it was a really good exercise to go through the policy. At the end of the day, I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible. I know it's a little late, but I wanted to kind of talk about what TDCs are, where they come from, and really how they impact the region as a whole and kind of our portfolio of projects. And then I'll briefly run through our policy and then kind of talk about what our recommendation is. And after looking at the policy, we are not recommending really any changes, and I'll explain why that is. But for anybody who's not familiar with transportation development credits, it's kind of a dry subject, but it's a federal finance tool that essentially waives the local match requirements on federally funded projects. So any of the federal funding that we give out as a policy board, there is a local match requirement, and it impacts the reimbursement process of the project. So a couple of key points though that I want to make are that TDCs are not cash and they're not additional funding. They only change really the reimbursement rate on a project, not the reimbursement amount. And one important thing that I'll actually have a slide specifically about this is that TDCs don't remove the obligation of sponsors to invest their local funding into the transportation system. It's called maintenance of effort, and I'll kind of explain that in a little bit. But, and hopefully y'all had a chance to go back through the background paper and look through the development process that we went through in 2017. But we kind of designed this policy to ensure that it adheres to federal and state laws, regulations, and procedures. We didn't really add anything on top of that. We just wanted to ensure that when we administer TDCs that we're following the federal and state laws that we have. So if you can go to the next slide, Emily. So an important thing to kind of note is how TDCs are earned. So they're earned actually by the state. It's a state program, and Campo kind of acts as the proxy for the state because the commission has delegated that 75% of TDCs are kind of that they are returned to the MPO in which they were earned. And the way they are earned is from toll revenues if they're reinvested into the transportation system and provide capital improvements for every dollar. I'm not quite sure what the exchange rate is. I need to go back and look but you earn from those investments, you earn TDCs. And so you can see the toll facilities we have in the region over there on the right in the green. But one thing I kind of want to point out, you've got our TDCs balances there at the bottom, is that there are a ton out there. We have close to 800 million. HGAC has close to 1 billion. NCT COG has as many as we do essentially. And then Txdot has that 25%, that $500 million. But nationwide, there are over 35 billion transportation development credits kind of sitting unused. And the reason I'm bringing that up is as I go through what TDCs, how they impact a program, they're really kind of a limited financial tool. That's one of the indicators to me as evidence of that is that the fact that we have so many sitting out there across the country that are really just sitting unused. So if you go to the next slide, please. So really, just to let anybody know, I wanted to talk about the reimbursement process briefly. So whenever we apply, somebody gets awarded federal funding, a local government, they incur those expenses up front, and then they submit those invoices on a regular basis. And then those invoices are reimbursed at 80%. And I've got an example here of a project that would hypothetically cost $1 million. The federal share would be 800,000, and the local share would be 200. If we go to the next slide, please. And this is really kind of shows you how TDCs impact a project. It effectively removes that local match, but the federal funding amount, and this is key, the reimbursement amount will not change. So the federal amount's all you have on the project. So in this case, when you submit the invoice, you'll get reimbursed at 100%. But both of the reimbursements in here and in a normal reimbursement process, you get reimbursed until you exhaust your federal funding. And in this case, the federal funding does not change with the application of TDCs. And so there are two ways to address that. If you'll go to the next slide. One thing you can do is once you pull off the local funding and you're left with only the federal dollar, you can really just reduce the scope down so that you can complete the project with only the federal share. So that's one important thing, and this is what happens when you retroactively apply TDCs to a project. If they were awarded federal funding, before the application of TDCs, they have to do a scope reduction in order to actually get the project through. And so, if you'll go to the next slide. So one of the other important consequences of applying TDCs, if you decide to apply for, and this is what we recommend in our policy, is that when you apply for federal funding, that you increase your federal funding request to cover the entire project cost. with the anticipation that you're going to apply for and be awarded TDCs. And so what this does two critical things that I kind of want to drive home, is that this increases the match and maintenance of effort requirement. So in this example here, instead of requesting $800,000, you would request the entire $1 million in federal funding. But the other critical thing, if you'll go to the next slide, please, is that it reduces federal funding availability across the region. It really concentrates federal funding on fewer projects. So because one thing is, one scenario that's often floated is, why don't we put TDCs on every single project? And the reason we don't do that is that because then fewer projects we would only be able to fund fewer projects, and then and fewer sponsors would get projects. So this is an example here, just 4 projects if you did not have TDCs versus if you applied TDCs to every single project. And to kind of really drive that point home, if you'll go to the next slide. This is an actual real world example. So during the project call in 2018, we actually encouraged anyone who wanted to apply for TDCs to send in an application concurrent with their funding application. And so we actually ended up applying 13 million credits to projects. I think it was about 7 projects that received TDCs alongside it. But because of that, we weren't able to go as far down the ranked list as we could have, we would have been able to fund 2 additional projects. And just for a hypothetical to show you, if we'd applied TDCs to every single project in the project call, based on rankings, we would not have been able to fund Slaughter Lane or William Cannon, Kenny Fort, the Works Dam Bridge, or the engineering work on 2243 or Yarrington or Williams Drive. So that's an important point to make, is that essentially you're just concentrating that federal funding, and so that means it does not get spread around as much. And so because I think that's just the scenario that I feel like I hear a lot is, can we just apply these to all the projects? And the reason we don't do that, one of the reasons we don't do that is because of this. If you'll go to the next slide, please. And so just to kind of run you briefly through our policy and our application process. So our policy basically has a lot of this information that I've just presented in there. It gives an overview of the TDC program, and it kind of gives those examples of how funding impacts both the project and the region as a whole. And then it also has the program goals from the state and the region. And then it has the eligibility requirements from the federal, state, and local eligibility requirements. I will say that even though we do have local eligibility requirements that we have put in there, they're really not necessary, because it really, we've only listed out projects that wouldn't be eligible for federal funding to begin with, so TDC. So we haven't added any additional eligibility requirements. And then it also just lays out the administrative process. And that process is really kind of carried through in the application process, where we ask the sponsor to show us how the project meets the policy goals, how it meets eligibility, and why they're requesting TDCs, and then how they're going to be able to address for the funding impacts on the project for that loss of local match we just want to ensure that if we award TDCs to a project, when you pull off that local funding, that you'll be able to still implement the project. And then of course, supporting materials. So all of this is really designed to ensure that we're adhering to the federal and state laws and regulations. If you'll go to the next slide, please. And finally, this is really kind of the core tenet of the TDC program. If you actually go to the federal law, there's not a whole lot there. There's really about 2 or 3 paragraphs. And the most important thing, and really kind of what dictates a lot of how we administer this policy, is the maintenance of effort requirement. This in 23 USC 120. So the credit, basically the credit for any non-federal share provided, you can't reduce or replace the state funds required to match federal funding. So essentially what we cannot allow, even if we apply TDCs to a project, we can't reduce the local funding investment in the transportation system. And we do that by evaluating things on a case-by-case basis. I think that's the main reason we don't do this blanket policy where we just give out TDCs without evaluating it. I think it's almost necessary. It is necessary to document what that secondary project, where that investment of the local match is going to go, because we have to provide that information to the state and federal agencies in order to get the TDCs approved, and also evaluating it on a case-by-case basis just allows us to really understand the impacts of applying TDCs to that project. So if you'll go to the next slide. And so this is my final slide, and I appreciate your patience. Really, our policy recommendation is, after we've taken a look back at what our policy has, we're not recommending any changes. And the reason for that is our policy really it does not preclude any eligible sponsors or projects from applying for TDCs. Like I mentioned, we don't add any additional restrictions or requirements. It's essentially if you meet those federal and state, eligibility requirements, then we'll forward that application to the policy board. And then, and again, the policy and the process ensures adherence to the federal and state laws, specifically including the maintenance of effort. So that concludes the presentation from me. Tim Tuggy also had a chance to do a legal review of this, and so I'm going to kind of pass it over to him to see if there's anything else he wants to mention about this. But I do want to say that I think this was a worthwhile exercise, and if there are scenarios, we'll continue to look into this and to see how other people administer their TDCs, other MPOs, other agencies in other states. You never know. We've kind of racked our brains around this and don't really think there's a more appropriate way to administer this program, but we will always continue to look at this with fresh eyes. And so with that, I will stop talking and hand this over to Tim Tuggy.
Just briefly, I conducted a review of our current policies that were adopted in 2017 against federal law and state law. As Ryan mentioned, there's specific statutory authority at the federal level, and there's administrative code requirements at the state level, all of which we comply with in our policy as it exists today. So that's all I wanted to add.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Are there any questions that anybody has? I think I see one from Commissioner Shea. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I had asked for some clarification on this, but it has come up as a request from other members of the policy board in the past. And my understanding was we had asked staff to develop a policy so that we wouldn't be doing this sort of case-by-case evaluation, and that there would be some criteria for applying TDCs, looking at things like how they would advance regional transportation goals or other priorities that we've identified, because otherwise, if it's just case by case, we'll probably have a similar discussion like this each time these come up. I mean, I thought the whole point of it was to have a policy that gave us some criteria to determine whether or not a TDC should be recommended to the policy board.
So and I don't want to put words in staff's mouth, but I think their recommendation was not to change. I mean, they went and looked, and their recommendation back was not to change it. If that's not acceptable to us as a policy board, we can look at that. But based upon their review, I think that's what I'm hearing. Ashby, do you want to weigh in at all, or?
Thank you, Chair. So, Commissioner, we did go back and take a look, and we do have a set of policy goals that were developed and approved by the policy board, and in particular towards TDCs. And we still feel like the current process that we have in place meets those policy recommendations the best. I know there are other MPOs in the state that do things a little bit differently, and they have goals, I would say, that are beyond some of what this policy board has adopted. And right now, based on the adherence to the law that Txdot does with us, we just didn't feel like we could recommend something different. So what I'm getting to, Commissioner, is every time we apply TDCs to something, we get an email from Txdot asking us to identify the maintenance of effort project to meet federal law. We're not sure that's happening everywhere. And so, we're making sure that we're following the pieces as it's being applied and as it says it in the law. But am I missing something, Commissioner?
Can I ask a question real quick, Ashby? Are you saying that that aspect's being applied arbitrarily and capriciously to different folks with different strokes?
I'm not saying arbitrary and capricious.
I'm just saying, because all of a sudden you said that they're applying stuff to us that they aren't doing to other folks over here, which doesn't make me happy.
It's unclear to us that it's being applied. I didn't say it wasn't. I didn't say arbitrary and capricious.
Well, I'm just recalling some of the past discussion where people have asked sort of what are the criteria that we're using, and does maintenance of effort mean generally achieving policy goals of Campo? Is that what does maintenance of effort mean?
It can mean that in part, but it also means more specifically. So if let's say the project was $100 and you're going to get 80% or $80 back from the federal portion, that other $20 that you would have spent for the whole project cost, federal government requires us to demonstrate that you aren't taking that $20 and put it on something else that's not transportation related. And so that's why they call it maintenance of effort. They don't want the program to be reduced as a result.
I didn't think we could spend money on things other than transportation related.
On your local money, I mean, Commissioner Shea.
At any rate, I had recalled a discussion that sought to at least have some sense of evaluating these projects rather than just doing it on a case-by-case basis. I will say, when we do bring future TDC projects, I think it would be useful for us to see, along with it, a list of all the previous TDC projects and the amounts, just so we have some sense of what we've already used these on. And I understand we have a gazillion TDCs, so it's not like we're going to run out. But it just seems to me like I don't have a clear understanding of the criteria we use to evaluate them and decide which ones we're going to recommend.
I think that's a great idea, Commissioner. We're giving you, every time we bring a TDC application forward, we're giving you the balances before and after if you decide to award the TDCs, but giving you the list of what's been awarded, I think is a great idea, and we can do that.
And then I think it would be useful to look at other MPOs and see if they require a secondary project. My understanding is that the North Central Texas COG does not. I don't know about the other MPOs, but it would just be useful to see if there's any kind of standard with regard to the use of these with other MPOs.
Yes, ma'am.
I think I see a question from Council Member Alter, and then if we can, so we don't start losing people, if we could start to wrap up. Go ahead, Council Member.
Thank you. I think I'll be quick. So am I right in understanding that currently we are using these only in situations where the scope of the project is reduced, so it's not reducing the amount of federal funding available to others by agreeing to these?
Sorry, I had to unmute. So we currently recommend that when people are applying for federal funding to apply for take into consideration TDCs at the same time, so that they are requesting a higher federal amount to cover the entire project cost. A reduction in scope is usually only required if somebody already has federal funding and local match on a project, but then they want to go back and take the local match off. So if they haven't accounted for TDCs at the beginning of the federal request, then they would need to reduce the scope of the project. So because once you apply TDCs to a project, all you're left with is the federal dollar that you originally were awarded. And so that's, it's not often, I think actually most of the TDCs that we've done, at least I know in the project call, everything was done concurrently. So nobody had to reduce the scope. But there have been cases where I think previous to that and previous to most everyone here now, I think where they've had to reduce the scope a little bit.
Okay, so currently we have situations where we're reducing the overall amount of federal funding available to the broader group without local governments doing their share of the 20%. They're using the TDCs instead.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess I appreciate the overview. I would like to understand, if possible, what other MPOs are doing, and to better understand, when we are, like, what our policy is for allowing folks to use the TDC is still a little vague to me. And whether it's something for the whole policy board or not, it's something that I think it sounds like you're doing anyway, and I'd like to be informed about that moving forward.
And certainly, if you go back to the original materials from the 2017 development, we did a blanket survey of all the MPOs in the state that get TDCs and across the country, and there is a chart in there that kind of breaks down the differences. But again, for this exercise that we did, recently over the last couple of months, we did go back and look because MPOs are constantly updating, and if somebody's thinking of something different, we need to be aware of that and see if that's something that may apply to this region. So that's what I mean. Why we're always open to kind of revisiting that. But after looking at this most recent survey and looking back at the policy that we did in 2017, we didn't really see how much that there was any wiggle room, and that's kind of why we stuck by especially the documentation efforts that are required is why we're recommending the case-by-case evaluation of projects, and especially how that impacts, if it's your jurisdiction that's getting TDCs, it impacts other jurisdictions and vice versa. So we kind of want that from a policy board perspective to take that holistic view of how each TDC application impacts the region.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. We're going to move on to item number 13, which is the Executive Director's Report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just a couple of things from me. This is going back to two previous items that the policy board has discussed today. This is related to funding of projects. As was referenced in those discussions, we have been told that as part of the COVID Relief Act that was passed recently, there was $10 billion approved for transportation, and that was across the entire United States, not just Texas. And that money's being split up. It's going to be treated the same as the Surface Transportation Block Grant funding, which is Category 7 in Txdot lingo. And we've also been told that that money will go to in our case, it will go to Txdot, but then it will be suballocated directly to organizations like ours that are over 200,000 in population. So it will be treated just like Category 7. At this point, I don't know how much money we're talking about, because normally when we get a new federal transportation bill, the same distribution formulas are applied. And since we know what the total is, and then they go through this process of doing a takedown, and then it's a takedown on something else of another program, and then they send us out a chart with every MPO in the country in it, and it's got the amounts in it. That chart has not come out yet. So I am trying every avenue I know in DC to get an advanced version of the chart so we can see what the dollars might look like and we can start planning. Commissioner Shea, you were saying earlier, or it might have also been Councilmember Kitchen as well, that we may be seeing money much faster than we thought in some cases, and you're correct. I don't think it'll be a year before we see that money. I think it'll be months, not a year. So to other board members' comments about projects and making sure that folks are, getting things ready, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And both the Txdot Austin District and Campo staff have been working towards that goal. As a reminder, we do a quarterly project progress report. And so we're talking to the sponsors on a very regular basis and asking them the status of the projects, also asking them if they need any help with advancing something and trying to make sure things don't get stuck. As a region, we want to be in a position of utilizing our funding as quickly as we can and as expeditiously as we can, so that we just don't have money sitting around on the table. So I am, as I said, still trying to get that chart. As soon as I can get my hands on it, I will send that out to the board, and then we would proceed from there. One of the other things I will do, and we'll send it out as part of the February board agenda, is we staff have taken a look at the calendar for this year, and we know those things that come up that we normally have to process for state and federal requirements. For example, like the fall and the spring TIP amendment cycles. We've laid those things out on the calendar, including the public outreach that will be required. And we're going to lay that out for you, that and other things that we know will happen. So you have some sense of what things may happen in what months of this year. Of course, that won't be exhaustive because at this point, we don't know anything. And a lot of things are up in the air, especially with the funding that we might get from federal sources outside of our normal federal transportation bill. Then I know we also have new board members on today. Welcome. And we normally provide a briefing for new members. We will provide that as well. So you will be hearing from us over the next couple of weeks to set up a meeting for us to come out. Well, I guess we can't come out anymore. I keep forgetting that. I'm not holding on to this COVID thing. I'm ready for it to go. So we will be contacting you about setting up a video conference to brief you on what we call Campo 101. So I think that's all for right now, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you, Ashby.
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Shea. I did have a question for Ashby.
Go ahead.
I mean, I put this generally under a report on transportation planning activities, and I tried to raise it earlier, but there was an email sent out by Matt Getsky, who's the Austin Chamber of Commerce transportation person, on November 9th, where he reported, and I'm just going to quote to it because I sent this out, but I don't know that it got to the whole board. Quote, as I mentioned during our mobility committee last week, Campo Chair Cynthia Long brought to the board edits to the Transportation Policy Board bylaws at their Monday meeting. Within that, she has asked Aero Executive Director Sandy Guzman and myself to begin working on the structure and objectives of a business advisory council for Campo. Our next steps involve meeting with our respective committee chairs this week and making calls to our regional partners to develop a list of potential business leaders to serve. I don't recall us discussing this at all. And it concerns me if this is happening in the community and it hasn't even been taken up by the policy board.
Commissioner, under my chair announcements that I deferred to the end of the meeting, thank you for bringing it up first. One of the things I asked the Aero is to look at what would it look like if we had a business advisory group that kind of weighed in from the just purely the business community to Campo. And it's sort of the which comes first, the chicken or the egg. So I talked to them to say, what would that proposal look like? And so that's what they're working on. And as soon as they get that finished, my plan was to bring that to the board and say, hey, this is a concept. And I think it would fall under ex officio, either board members or other subcommittees. I think it would be a great opportunity to hear from the business community. And so as soon as they flush that out, my plan was to bring that to the board and to kind of hear from them as to what they think that might look like. So that was under chair announcements.
So are you now adding that to the direction to the subcommittee that you set up for them to discuss and make a recommendation back to the board?
No, Commissioner, it's not really a bylaw issue. It's just, it was a Cynthia idea on how we can improve communication with the business community. So once that's fleshed out, I will bring it back to the board. And ultimately, it's up to the board as to whether we do anything with that or not. I just was asking for input from the business community on that. And once it's fleshed out, we'll be happy. I mean, we'll be bringing it back to the board as an item to look at.
I would like then to put before the board that we also consider the creation of a citizens advisory committee so that we hear from other perspectives other than just business, and also an environmental advisory committee, because that has a huge impact on much of what we do and is a huge part of our economic well-being in this community.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Ashby, you didn't have anything else, correct? Okay, so on the announcements, we've got a TAC meeting on January 25th and a policy board meeting on February 8th. And again, to our new members, welcome. I too will be reaching out to you to welcome you. And thank you for your attention today. I appreciate it. And with that, we will stand adjourned.